So at this time, we'd want to kindly ask all of you to take a second to ensure that your audio is muted. We've done so at the beginning, so all of you should have been muted upon entry, so please stay muted. My name is Halena Kapuni-Reynolds, and I am very excited to be the host for this wonderful webinar today. I am currently a PhD student in American Studies at the University of Hawaiʻi at Manoa, where I have the honor of working as the graduate assistant of the Museum Studies Graduate Certificate Program. And I also currently serve as a board member of the Hawaiʻi Museums Association. Today's webinar, similar to the webinar that we had in July, will feature a variety of presentations, but today we're excited to have knowledge holders and practitioners and experts who will be talking a little bit about their experiences as individuals working on Kauaʻi as well as Oʻahu. And the purpose of our webinar today, Mākau Moʻomeheu, an online webinar on cultural competency, is really to ask some critical questions at this point in time, especially with regards to our institutions here in the islands. And we really want folks to consider, what does the museum in Hawaii look like in the 21st century? And how might our institutions engage with more grassroots efforts, such as this Aloha Aina economy that is gaining traction at the moment as we reconsider what our economy will look like for the years to come. Now, one of the things I wanted to share with you folks is a simple word cloud, because I love visuals. And this word cloud is based on what you've submitted as registrants. And this word cloud basically summarizes responses to this question: what do you hope to learn by participating in these webinars? And as you can see, the larger words indicate the amount of responses where individuals use those words to describe what they would hope to learn. And as you can see here, the words that occur in the highest frequencies are words like learn, Hawaiian, museums, practices, hope, collections, indigenous, knowledge. These are all things that I think that our speakers today will be addressing, and we will be continuing this dialogue from our past webinar. And I'm really excited to be able to have this opportunity to speak with you all today on such an important topic. So before we begin, I want to mahalo our sponsors, the Hawaii Tourism Authority, the Hawaiʻi Museums Association, East-West Center, the Museum Studies Graduate Certificate Program at the University of Hawaiʻi at Manoa, as well as Olelo TV for their support for these webinars. And if you like the content that Hawaiʻi Museums Association offers, and if you'd like to support our causes, you might consider joining us as an individual member. And for more information on that, you can visit our website at hawaiimuseums.org. So today the webinar consists of 2 sessions, and some of you who came to our webinar, our first webinar, will be familiar with the format. The first session includes PowerPoint and panel presentations by 3 cultural competency educators, who will be sharing examples of cultural competency, what it looks like, the framework of cultural competency, and some concrete examples of how institutions can implement cultural competency within the workplace. Our second session features 3 cultural practitioners, knowledge holders, and experts from Kauaʻi and Oʻahu, who will share some of their thoughts with regards to cultural competency, but also some of their experiences of working in museums and the heritage sector to address some of the challenges, and perhaps to let us know some of those, or to have some of those hard conversations that we need to have in order to move the field forward and to essentially become 21st institutions. During these sessions, there will be 2 short breaks, and we'll let you know when those breaks are. And so we want to encourage all of you to make yourselves comfortable and to excuse yourself when you're needed. This is a webinar, this is not a live show, so we won't necessarily see you. If you need to go somewhere, you can mute your video if you'd like. Really just take the time to make yourself comfortable, because we're going to be in it for the long ride, which will be 3 hours. And we also want to let you know that a recording of this webinar will be made available on the Hawaiʻi Museums Association YouTube page. And we're working on editing the closed captions because we realize that one of the issues with auto-generating the captions when you upload the videos is that non-English words get butchered, and we do not want the Hawaiian language to be butchered. So we are working our way through those captions to make sure that those are accurate. So please be patient with us as we edit those captions. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our first set of speakers. So our first panelist is Helen Wong Smith. Helen is currently archivist for university records at the University of Hawaii at Manoa. She holds a BA in Hawaiian Studies as well as a Master's in Library Science from UH Manoa. Throughout her 35-year career, Helen has worked in libraries and archival collections across Hawaii at places such as the University of Hawaii at Hilo, the Pacific Island Network of the National Park Service, the Land Assets Division of Kamehameha Schools, and the State of Hawaii Historic Preservation Division. She has also served as president for the Hawaii Library Association, the Hawaiian Historical Society, and the Association of Hawaii Archivists. Since 2015, Helen has traveled across the United States to advocate for cultural competency within the archival profession. In 2016, she was named a Distinguished Fellow of the Society of American Archivists. Our second panelist is Tarisi Vunidilo. Tarisi is an assistant professor in anthropology at the University of Hawaii at Hilo, where she teaches courses on Pacific and Indigenous museology. She received her PhD in Pacific Studies in 2016 from the University of Auckland after successfully defending her thesis titled Iyau Vakaviti, Fijian Treasures, Cultural Rights, and Repatriation of Cultural Materials from International Museums. Tarisi also holds a Master's in Anthropology and a postgraduate diploma in Maori and Pacific Development from the University of Waikato, a postgraduate diploma in the arts from the Australia National University in Canberra, and a BA in Geography, History, and Sociology from the University of the South Pacific. She has published 2 books and several articles about Fijian pottery, language, and archaeology. Prior to her appointment at UH Hilo and throughout her career, Tarisi has held positions at Creative New Zealand, the Waikato Museum of Art and History, the National Museum of New Zealand Te Papa Tongarewa, and the Fiji Museum. She also currently volunteers as Secretary General for the Pacific Islands Museums Association, otherwise known as PIMA, and works between her office in Port Vila, Vanuatu, and Hilo, Hawaii. And I am the last panelist for this first round. You already know me, I gave my introduction. So please welcome our panelists.
Okay. Aloha. Can you hear me all? All hear me? All of me? Okay. Fantastic. Mahalo, Halena. This is a very unique situation because I'm giving this to many of you who have been born and reared in Hawaii, and cultural competency is almost something that's innate to us because we grew up in a geographic area that is so small with such a diverse cultural makeup that we learned it. But as I went further and further in my career and worked with different cultural repositories, I realized that a lot of the discussion that's been going on now toward equity, diversity, and inclusion could really be helped out by cultural competency. So I'm here to present a very simple overview, just to create the basis for today's session of what cultural competency is. And let's see, why can't I go forward? There we go. So this is the definition. There are many definitions of cultural competency. Often you hear it referred to as intercultural competency, cultural sensitivity, and so on. But this is something that looking at all the different interpretations and definitions, I felt was the most useful and universal. So it is a framework because so many institutions and professions are saying, oh, we have to be more diverse, we have to be more inclusive. What are we going to do about inclusion? And it's almost too big a subject that people got stymied. That's what I saw in my profession, is that it was almost too big. And then I realized, you know what, if we apply the framework of cultural competency, that is a way to achieve those high in the sky ideals of equity, diversity, and inclusion. So this is why I have suggested it across in my profession, and it has been welcomed across the nation, and people are beginning to see its benefits. It started off in the medical field and social sciences, and people are seeing that this is applicable in everything. And the museum profession has also adopted it. So why are we doing it? Well, this is what the goal is. If to by employing cultural competency in all levels, and we'll talk about the 3 levels, it should combine cultural mindedness. So these are, it starts at a personal level, but it should be able to go up the ranks so that it's the organization and the profession. So we like to think that this is going to be a methodology that can be adopted and embraced by the museum profession and other adjunct professions as far as the heritage sector. So even the Association of American Art, the American Association of Museums, I want to get that right, or you can flip the 2 around. They have recognized this themselves. And so they have, when you look at their resources, they have utilized this whole training that was adopted at the Association of Science and Technology Centers at the higher level. And so they're saying, wow, this is a way to address diversity, equity at your repository. So by using this, it will allow you to have individuals to work effectively with others, increase the ability of the organizations to maximize the benefits within their workforces, and very importantly, improve the services of the museums to offer to stakeholders. And when we say stakeholders, I'm going to venture to say that we're not just talking about your visitors. We're talking about your donors. We're talking about your hopefully community collaborative partners that Tarisi will talk about in the future, in the next presentation. So let's define culture. Well, there's a lot of different definitions out there, especially the first ones came out from the World Health Organization. But this is one that I feel is most applicable to us. And that's the shared actions of groups of people. And, you know, even though it says express daily, sometimes our particular culture does not come out on a daily basis. Sometimes we have to submerge or tamp down what our true culture is to fit in the larger culture or the working culture that we may be placed in. And it will come out only when in times of conflict or only in times of stress as such. So this is something that it is really holistic. And remember that everybody has multiple cultures. You may have a particular culture when you're or identify with, not only because you are not one-dimensional, but so remember that about your colleagues, but also in the stages of your life. So you may transfer or play up different aspects of your cultures. And so let's look at some of the examples of where this comes from. It comes from your experience. So what your upbringing was, what's the religion that you may have been brought up with, and all of these different things. So for instance, I like to use the example of trauma. You know, so your experience was trauma. And so just one cultural group, social cultural group, might be veterans. Another one could be people who have been, I was listening to a diversity and cultural, they called it diversity, work in a diverse and workplace that someone said, okay, I wasn't disabled when I came in to this job, but I became injured and now I can't perform certain duties because of now my wrist will never be able to carry 40 pounds or something like that. And the difference in the types of reaction she got from her coworkers. So here is somebody who's now disabled, and the way her coworkers or her boss is treating her is very different. So this is she is now in a new cultural group of disabled. So when we think of culture, it's very important to realize that what we can see in our colleagues or our patrons or our donors, stakeholders, is above the surface. It's very obvious. Okay, yes, they eat different foods. They celebrate things, holidays, or celebrate things that we are not familiar with. However, it's the underwater, the deep culture that is so vital, because that's what's going to come through in times of collaboration, in times of conflict, in times of problem solving, their methodology. So these are all it takes you have to really go out and search for it. If it's not innate, and it isn't most people, you have to be cognizant of its existence. And you may say, wow, they reacted that so differently than I would. Well, exactly, because they're not of the same culture. So this is a graphic that I encourage people to look at. And sometimes you can start saying like, oh yeah, I didn't realize that they have a different concept of time. Or, when I was with the Park Service in Samoa, a Western Midwest worker had such a hard time working with the Samoan museum aide, because she said, oh, he pick up every object and look at it slowly. She's like, come on, let's go. Not really, but his work was spotless. So this is a difference in culture that she had to become aware of. So what I like to point out is one of my favorite New Yorker magazine cartoons, and that I find this happening so often in Hawaii, is that someone will come in with a very preliminary or very academic knowledge of Hawaiian culture and assume that they know it all. I've had my son, who's a graduate student, has actually had professors who've been here for 3 months, and they go, oh yes, I know all about the Hawaiian experience. You don't explain that to me. And he's ready to strangle them. So this is something that I want people to realize, is that no matter what you may know of another culture, it's not your culture. And so never assume that you know everything about it. You can be knowledgeable, but don't make the assumption that you did a little bit of research and therefore you're the cultural expert. And I think that often happens in repositories like ours that have the material. You have the artifacts, we have the records, and we go, oh yes, let me tell you what I have about your culture. Let's avoid that. So cultural competency is actually a continuum, and it's iterative. Okay, I'm tired. It's a formative assessment, which is ongoing and will often place you in an uncomfortable position. When I give my one-day workshop on the mainland, I don't give the pre-test to say I have difficulty working with cultures unlike my own, because nobody's going to admit that. Or I devalue, that's the other one I like. I devalue cultures that are not in line with mine. And nobody's going to admit that. So it's often when you are in an uncomfortable position, or there's some kind of conflict that you're like, why does this make me feel so uncomfortable? That's usually what happens. And so the three aspects are really grounded in self-awareness. It's just hard to do, because if you've been operating in a particular vacuum or in a particular profession or in a repository that has always done it this way, it is very difficult to accept a new one. I know that many years ago, a friend was working with Daughters of Hawaii at Queen Emma Summer Palace. And she said, oh, these old ladies, you know, they just no, the table for the jams go here because it's always been that way. And so, you know, it's also, there's a lot of ageism as another issue with cultural competency and such. So you have to seek the knowledge. You have to, it's the cognitive part, is the self-awareness and seeking the knowledge. And you have to be empathetic. So it's a behavioral skill to be empathetic to someone that you can't identify with. So you may have the knowledge, but the next step of being empathetic is going to go much further than just having the academic knowledge. And then it's the attitude. Once you have gotten over you've achieved the knowledge and you're trying to be empathetic, often it's your attitude toward the other person that speaks volumes. And so these are three aspects that really make a difference when you're interacting with another culture. And my friend Manu, who I love to, I don't have any tattoos, but I would tattoo this probably. If knowledge is power, understanding is revelation. And I think that is something that so often in the professions we need to be aware of, is that you may have the knowledge, but understanding where that other person is coming from is going to make all the difference in the world. So to give you an example, the Arab American National Museum was established after post 9/11, and so what they do is that for different groups that come in, they tailor what they're going to share with them, how they're going to share it with them, because a group of seniors who did not grow up with Arab Americans in their community or in their workplace are going to be very different in comparison to business executives that are thinking, okay, how is this going to impact my bottom line if the Arab Americans are treated this way, or if they have to go back to whatever, you know, they lose their green card, or even those that are multi-generational, what is the cultural trauma that they have grown up with. And so this is something that I love to emphasize, because I once took a group of the Association of Hawaiʻi Archivists. We go to other islands every so many years, and we were at a unnamed, I shall unname, keep this on Kauaʻi, a house on Kauaʻi. And the tour guide did not bother to figure out who we were. So she's giving the most basic information about Hawaiian history to the likes of Agnes Conrad and Mary Judd and Paula Rath. You know, it was just so embarrassing to, you know, she had her automatic tape in her head of what she was going to say to any group that came through. This house was built in this, and the Hawaiians did this, and the missionaries came in 1820, and it was painful. So this is the type of thing that I encourage you to consider. And it's an active process. This is not something that you learn, take a test, and call it a day. This is something that is constantly going on. So it includes sometimes many messy elements to explore. So what I always encourage people is that consider EMEC conceptualization, not ETEC. Don't go out and read something about somebody outside of that culture who spent many years studying them, and then going in and saying, well, I read their books and I read their accounts of this culture, so therefore I know all about this culture. No, get somebody from that culture itself. And it is a holistic approach to change, because you cannot, if you're truly going to adopt cultural competency, it is not just learning about it and then not allowing it to affect your behavior. So this is something to consider as well. So here are the three levels that I was referring to. If you don't learn it at the micro level, you have to recognize it for yourself. You recognize the diversity within yourself and then those that you interact with. And then if you are able to do this, then hopefully more people will be able to see that why is it that this person is always able to get along with that group? That's not even their culture, and yet they're such good liaisons to that particular group. You know, then others will see the benefits of cultural competency and operating with that, and then hopefully it'll get down up to the macro level as the organization becomes culturally competent. I hate mission statements that say we accept diverse applicants, or we are always doing, you know, we are inclusive, diverse, and it's all on paper. It's all pala. Nobody follows through on it. You see them hiring the same old people with the same type of credentials, not operating from any, looking at other qualifications that may not fit in their particular rubric, and always going and seeking the same types of hires, or the same types of people to give the instruction, or to give the tours, or or do the interpretation. I mean, Tarisi is going to talk about interpretation. That is a huge paradigm shift in Auckland. So this is the type of thing that I want people to realize, that it has to start at the individual level. And so this is something that we need to recognize. So there's 4 levels, there's 4 skills. One of the frameworks of cultural competency is to understand that culture is multi-level and multi-dimensional. I talk about there's culture at the personal level. And so one's personal identity is formed through interacting with one's social group. So of course, you're going to have a different social culture with you're working with your family, you're interacting with your family, or at work, and so on. And ethnicity is just one influence of personal identity. I always try to tell people ethnicity is not culture. It is one, but it's not the only definition of culture. So let's stop doing that. Other influences include age, race, gender, ableness, physical appearance, and socioeconomic position. You know, sometimes you have people who are homeless, they're fully employed, but you have to acknowledge and you have to empathize with what they're going through, because they're not sure where they're going to sleep tonight. Whose cousin's couch are they going to be surfing tonight? So the outcomes of this will be, you'll recognize different ways of thinking and communicating, and you'll recognize that culture has these different aspects to it that you may not have even considered as a cultural at one time. So this is, and then the barriers is often we have the language. Somebody was sharing that she's deaf in one ear. And so when she speaks very loudly. And so she's getting complaints from her coworkers, like, she always talks so loudly. Well, yeah, because she can't hear herself. So this is the type of thing that, you know, you got to let go of the judgment. And stereotyping, a generalization is the beginning, stereotyping is the end point. So when you stereotype people, you're just really cutting down, you're just putting up these barriers, you're cutting down any possibility of having a dialogue and understanding their culture. So these are some of the skill sets. The other is to practice culturally centered communication. This often happens in times of problem solving. You know, often it's the example of Ho'oponopono. Everybody says, oh, let's do Ho'oponopono. Well, unless everybody who's involved totally accepts and buys into the concept and the reason of Ho'oponopono works, it's not going to do anything. And I've seen this happen many times. They said, oh, we're going to be culturally competent, we're going to do Ho'oponopono. And then you have half the members that don't understand it, and they're going through the motions, and that's not going to help anything, because they went, oh, well, we did Ho'oponopono, everything's fine. No, it's not fine, because you didn't have a shared understanding of all of it. So with these, if you can practice, let me go back to, where we go. Here we go. So if you can practice this, communication skills, you're going to have much better outcomes. Show the respect, have the patience, recognize that there, and assume complexity. That's the other thing that people often forget. So culturally competent communication skills, of course, will start at interpersonal, and then it'll go up the ladder to meso and then macro. And this is something that often people jump straight to, the culturally competent organization, and they don't have any teeth. It's just a statement. But there are ways of creating culturally competent organizations, and many times it's to utilize some of these things. And what I have liked, some organizations that have been very successful in creating culturally competent strategies. So for instance, they connect with two organizations of that particular culture for job referrals. So, you know, how often do we do that, especially in university, right? We just put it out on the Chronicle of Higher Education and call it a day. And that there might be people that have the competency or have the skill sets that are perfect for this job, but they're not operating in the traditional ways that we look for our employees or our volunteers or what have you. So this is it's an initiative, solicit community input and participation. I know of a repository that they brought in somebody from the mainland to be the head of the collection, and the community just went nuts. They said, wait, you have somebody who was born and reared and trained here. She is part of this community, and you're not letting her have a role. She's now got to answer to this person. This is not cool. So this is the kind of information collaborative that you should be employing. I want to share something, and I don't know how I missed it, but when we're talking about communication, Puake and I experienced a fantastic example. We went to the East Coast. We had a week, I believe, at Harvard, and then a week in DC. And we're all at the National Archives and Records Administration too in Maryland. And as the custom of Puake's students, you know, they're all gathered at one table. Everybody else is in the reading room doing their own research, and they're all together. And one of the translators kicks off her boots under the table. And somebody from the staff comes running up and goes, "Whose boots are these?" And she, oh, they're mine. He goes, "You have to keep your footwear on in here, lady." And, so, and everybody just looked at me like, why did you bring us here? So this is, you know, not culturally competent. This is not, that kind of reaction and that kind of communication was not appropriate. So you have the benefits in museums of having artifacts, and artifacts are a wonderful way to teach cultural competency. I know when Janet Zisk was the archivist for Kamehameha Schools, she would actually take one of Pauahi's little calabashes and take it to the classroom. My son remembers when he was in kindergarten in Keaukaha, when KS was instilling Keaukaha, and being able to hold Pauahi's something that belonged to her. So this is a benefit that often having an artifact really emphasizes the cultural aspect of another person that you're not familiar with. And it's been used very effectively in the museum world. So it starts with listening, and it's something that, don't be patriarchal. Let's let go. It's time to let go of the colonization mentality and patronizing, and to consider the communities, the community partners. Look at them as a resource. You're not there to educate them. They're there to educate you too. So this is something that it creates a lot of humility on our part as those of, you know, in the repositories. And if you recognize them as the expert, it will benefit you 100-fold. So let's not focus on the differences, but celebrate the differences and make it beneficial for all of us. Okay, mahalo.
Thank you very much, Helen. All right. So I actually made a mistake in how I introduced ourselves because I am actually the second speaker. So let me pull up my presentation for you all. And here we go. I want to share some thoughts and reflections regarding cultural competency in Hawaii's museums. These thoughts and reflections are from my experiences as a young Native Hawaiian researcher with an interest in the field of Hawaiian archaeology. Ultimately, what these experiences have afforded me is the opportunity to learn more about some of the issues that continue to divide Hawaii's heritage sector today. Issues that I continue to familiarize myself with as I begin a career in nonprofit and heritage management. I share some of these thoughts with you in the hope that they provide concrete methods and lessons for those who work in Hawaii's heritage sector and how to approach, collaborate, and learn from those community members, cultural practitioners, and knowledge holders that we oftentimes rely on as we develop programs, exhibitions, and learn more about the indigenous belongings that we curate within our institutions. Given the short amount of time that I have with you today, I decided to frame my presentation through Ōlelo no Eau. Ōlelo no Eau are Hawaiian proverbs and poetical devices or sayings that convey information about a place, being, or a phenomena. They offer lessons about how to conduct oneself at any given time and how to better understand the environment in which one finds themselves in. Although the Ōlelo no Eau that I will share today are ones that I learned through my lifetime, we are fortunate to have an entire book on Ōlelo no Eau that was compiled by Mary Kawena Pupui. It is a great addition to any library. When I was a student at Keanola'ahana Public Charter School in Keaukaha on the island of Hawaii, I remember helping my sister, who was a teacher at my school, to create these Ōlelo no Eau cards that she posted around her classroom. And each of the black and red cards included an Ōlelo no Eau that she selected in a stamp design that we created using whatever plants were available around us. The purpose of these Ōlelo no Eau were simple yet effective. They were a constant visual reminder for students on how to conduct themselves in the classroom. They conveyed lessons through the oral turned written word about Hawaiian values and practices. And likewise, for the purpose of this webinar, we can think of Ōlelo no Eau as heuristic devices that offer us a window into Hawaiian cultural competency. These are the kinds of things that we teach our keiki in our kula in our schools. And so they provide us with a very fundamental foundation from which we can approach this. And I also think in presenting these Ōlelo no Eau, they can be a reminder, a mnemonic device for those of us here to conduct ourselves and approach others to accomplish our goals, to create the kinds of worlds that we'd like to see. So the first Ōlelo no Eau that I have for you today, this is the definition. The first Ōlelo no Eau is Pa'akavaha, Nana Kamaka, Ho'oloheka Pepeau, Hana Kalima. Keep your mouth shut, your eyes open, your ears listening, and your hands busy. This was one of the first Ōlelo no Eau that I learned as a Hawaiian immersion student at Kekula Kaiapuni o Keaukaha. Our kumu, or teachers, would always have this Ōlelo no Eau posted in their classroom as a reminder to students on how they should behave. More broadly, the Ōlelo no Eau conveys a particular Hawaiian approach to learning that centers mentorship, discipline, and care. It teaches us that before we say anything, we need to first observe and listen with intent. And from these lessons, we then begin to do things with our hands. Translated for the webinar, this Ōlelo no Eau can take on these meanings. That when you reach out to cultural practitioners, community members, and other knowledge holders, do it with intent. Listen carefully to the issues and concerns that they are raising, and develop outcomes that align with community as well as institutional needs. Secondly, it's important to listen and learn from other staff members. Be observant so that you and your coworkers can recognize each other's strengths and contributions and work strategically with care to create, with our hands, our lima, the institutional changes that we seek. The second olelo no eau is a'ole pau ka ike I ka halau ho'okahi. All knowledge is not taught in the same school. One can learn from many sources. This olelo no eau is one that we oftentimes hear because it is a reminder that we each store different forms of knowledge that we have learned from specific teachers, mentors, and elders. It is oftentimes used as an expression of the diversity within the Hawaiian community to recognize different lineages of thought, practice, and expression. In 2014, when I was doing research on how Hawaiian chiefly or ali'i collections were curated at the Bernice Pauahi Bishop Museum and the Lyman House Memorial Museum, it became apparent to me that those who handled ali'i collections on a day-to-day basis, i.e. the collections managers, some of whom were Native Hawaiian, drew from their cultural knowledge base to inform how they handled and showed respect for these special collections. Whether they were practices and or beliefs that they learned through their family or from, for example, a hula halau, collections managers drew from these experiences to critically consider how to properly care for ali'i collections. So within this olelo no eau, we can consider the following. That a graduate degree is not a guarantee of someone's work experience and interpersonal skills, and it should not be the only measure for considering whether or not someone is hired or receives promotion. Again, different forms, different halau, different knowledge bases. And the work experience is derived, or the experience that we bring into the work that we do is derived from multiple experiences that happen not only within our institutions, but beyond the walls of the museum, oftentimes in community. And lastly, we all come from different lineages of knowledge that we carry with us and inform how we conduct ourselves. The last olelo no eau that I would like to share with you all is ika olelo no keola, ika olelo no kamake. Life is in speech and death is in speech. Words can heal and words can destroy. When I am told this olelo no eau by Kumu or Kupuna, they remind me of the power of the spoken word. What we can say, or what we say can, and oftentimes do have material consequences. And this is something that a lot of us believe wholeheartedly. As an example of this, we're always told stories of kahuna ana ana, for example, who are oftentimes described as priests with the ability to pray someone to death. But it also conjures up images of the story of Hi'iaka i Kapolio Pele and how Hi'iaka revives Pele's lover, Lohi'au, through chant and ritual, through her spoken voice and her words. More recently, historian Noelani Arista has historicized this olelo no eau as one that refers to the authoritative power of the ali'i. And through their oral command, an individual could be either killed or spared for transgression. A more recent example of the power of words as it relates to ali'i in museums is the recent transfer of ownership of Kalani Opu'u and his ahu'ula in Mahi'ole from the National Museum of New Zealand Te Papa, Tongarewa, to the Bernice Pauahi Bishop Museum. The long-term loan that resulted in Kalani Opu'u's return to Hawaii, which now has become permanent, began with in-person conversations between Te Papa staff and Kanaka Maoli, who would pilgrimage to the museum to visit these ancestral belongings. These conversations, these words, years in the making, eventually turned into legal decisions and material outcomes that will continue to inform issues around international repatriation for years to come. Thus, ika olelo no keola, ika olelo no kamake allows us to think through cultural competency because it, one, illustrates the power of the spoken word to effect change and transformation, and two, demonstrates the impact that can be made when promises and obligations are fulfilled. And this is so important because broken promises oftentimes is frustrating for our communities and is something that we carry with us, especially when we work with various institutions. And it's for these reasons that oftentimes there is a sense of hesitancy with regards to working with museums and like institutions. So to end today, I wanted to speak directly to cultural competency and what this webinar aims to achieve or ignite within you all. As I see it, cultural competency can mean the following things. It means having and being brave to have the hard conversations we need to have in our institutions. It means committing to social justice and enacting change where possible and necessary. It means knowing the history of your institution and the broader history of the place that you work. Learning how to listen with the intent to enact changes that benefit your workplace and the community that you belong to. It requires listening to the communities we serve and bringing them into our institutions in ways that are mutually beneficial and productive, not a one-way service. It means leading by example. And lastly, working together across our differences to achieve the common goals that we share or we develop together. With these things in mind, let us listen and learn with intent. Let us recognize each other's abilities and lineages of knowledge that guide our work. Let us choose our words carefully and speak radical change into the present and future. Mahalo. And we will continue on with Tarisi's presentation, but first, we will start with this video.
One of the big things with this project is very much around capturing the information in their own reo, and how things were made traditionally. So to me, in a lot of ways, it's actually giving back the voice of our taonga that we have, that we're very privileged to be kaitiaki of here in this whare. The community are the experts because their eyes have seen, their ears have heard, their hands have made. There have been so many memorable moments. We've had a lot of elders come into the whare, and just the emotion for them, I suppose, very much around reconnecting. A lot of them recalling a lot of their grandparents who used to teach them how to weave, or were the first parts of the journey for them to actually learn a lot of their heritage art, and to keep a lot of these traditions and cultures alive. We've had a lot of young people, probably second, third generation born Kiwis now, and just they're connecting. A lot of them are now, don't speak the language. They don't have that much contact, to a lot of the kind of more, culture, kind of tradition side of it, but know that they are very much, Moana Pacific. And what does that mean? And just the emotion that they've felt has been truly uplifting, I think, and this just really stamps, the kaupapa and what we're trying to do here in this kind of whare, in this kind of museum, just to be that reconnector, but also just be a space where they feel safe, that they can come in and just feel. There's been lots of tears, lots of singing. We've been honoured to have one family come in with 4 generations, and just to have that kind of learning, that kind of intergenerational learning, but also just around love. And then for me to have them breathing on the taonga that maybe one of their ancestors may have made, is beautiful. Yeah, I think it would be really nice for other museums to consider, making this the norm, because I can truly say, while it can be a little bit special in the beginning, the rewards are just amazing.
Okay, Vinakavakalevu for the warm welcome there, Halena. It's beautiful chanting. That's what we do a lot when we were at the Auckland Museum. So that's actually one of the projects that I was privileged to be part of in 2016. And that will be the core part of my presentation today, is to discuss cultural competency in action. And this is a wonderful example of what the Auckland Museum has done. And I think they've set the bar for museums around the world to actually do. And as you can hear, what my sister Barbara Afitu was sharing, she mentioned words like feelings, she mentioned singing, you know, she mentions words, and those were very much, you know, incorporated in the whole work that we did in the museum. And to me, that is a core part of cultural competency. And it's such a wonderful privilege that I'm here to share that story. So I would like to say Mbula Vinaka and aloha to you all, and thanking the Hawaii Tourism Authority or Association maybe, and the Hawaii Museum Association for inviting me to be part of this webinar. I also wear the hat of PIMA, which is the sister organization to the Hawaii Museums Association. So it represents all the museums in the Pacific region, and the main office of PIMA is based in Port Vila. And I bring the greetings of the PIMA board, particularly our president, Joseph Cameron, who is based in Guam. So today's presentation, I would like to present the 3 C's. First C is community, second is culture, which my sister Helen has alluded to, and thirdly is collaboration, which is very much the video that you watched before. The intention of having the video earlier on is to put us into the context of a museum, and what we as indigenous communities and museum curators, some may be indigenous, some maybe not, how we can work together better in months and years to come. And these are the 7 key actions that I would like to present here. And this is based very much on the project that you've just watched. And this was a wonderful experience that I was invited to be one of the knowledge holders for Fiji. And I would like to also acknowledge my 2 other Fijian colleagues, Choana Monolangi from the province of Serua and Alipati Trail from Lomaiviti province. And I come from the southern province of Fiji in Kandavu. So based on the work that I did at the Auckland Museum, acknowledging Jamie Williams, Fulimalo Pereira, Kolokesamahi Natuai, Sarah Bishop, who is actually from Hawaii, and I had the privilege of working with her in Aotearoa. These are the 7 key actions that I want to share that really kind of resonated with me as someone who worked in the museum, but someone that works closely with the community. So the first one that comes to mind is reminding ourselves that there's no one size fits all for us as a people, as a region. As I can see in many museums around the world, you know, it's always like we all clump together, you know, maybe for space purposes, maybe for, you know, regional purposes. But I think it's important that museum curators and museum collection managers should know that there are diversity within our region. And they need to, number 2, familiarize themselves with the region. Learn the geography, learn the island names, be familiar with the cultures of the people. You know, for example, in Papua New Guinea, you know, the amazing information about Papua New Guinea, they have more than 800 languages in one island nation. And you can imagine the diversity that comes with it, the artifacts that will be kept inside the museum. And so it'll pose challenges, but it poses a lot of positive things that curators and collection managers and museum directors can do with this wonderful information. Number 5, find out if there are Papua New Guineans in your neighborhood. And I have to say, as a Pacific Islander and as a migrant myself, Pacific Islanders are everywhere. You know, Fiji, I think, is at the top of the list too, I must say. So I can encourage everyone, find out if they are there and talanoa with them. So talanoa is a Polynesian word for talk story. And invite them to come to the museum. You can invite them to be part of a museum program or a tour, but you have the opportunity to work with these community members to create the programs and create the tours, which exactly happened for this project, the PCAP project, Pacific Collections Access Project. We were able, in the case of Fiji, we were able to bring in more than 3,000 Fijians to come in the space of 1 year, to come in and see these artifacts. And even the island of Rotuma were also invited. Some of you may not know much about Rotuma, but Rotuma is a Polynesian island that has been given to Fiji by British colony. And so their artifacts, very interesting about this, their artifacts were classified under Fiji. And so when I came into the museum one day with Chowana and Alipate, I looked at the fans and I looked at the mats, and I said, these are not Fijians. And the curators at the Auckland Museum were like, really? The label said Fiji. And I knew straight away, as I saw it, I said, you know what? These fans and these mats and all these beautiful baskets, they are from the island of Rotuma. And even the curators are like, where's Rotuma? And so it was a wonderful case study to realize that, you know, our curators can get out of their, you know, their comfort zone and get to know the region better. And number 7, which is very important, collaborate. Yeah, so another of the C, collaborate, collaborate, collaborate. And I think that's the most important word that I want to share in terms of working with our communities. And our communities definitely, as what Helen was saying before, when it comes to culture, it involves people. Yeah, he tangata, he tangata, he tangata. It's a people, it's a people, it's a people. And so here we are. These are the various islands that you know, we get to represent. In the region is quite a huge number of islands and lots of things that you can learn. As I was saying before, you know, it may be you know, a challenge. Definitely, yes. There's volume of information, you can get overwhelmed by it, but it can be done, yeah, if we put our time and effort to get to know the region. So let's get into this wonderful project that I was part of. And again, reiterating that this project is cultural competency in action. What did we do in this project? Okay, so when we were introduced to work with more than 1,500 artifacts, we had to sit as a team and try and devise a way on how we can get our Fijian community in. And so for those of you who may not know, Fiji is divided into 3 confederacies. So one of that is on the screen, Towata, the other 2 is Kumbuna, and another one is Murembasana. So that was the most realistic way where we can be able to get all these, you know, 3,000 plus Fijians into the museum. Now that I look back, it's, you know, really easy to talk about it, but to actually do it was really hard. But what we did was we worked with our strengths. We worked with our strength. We worked with what we know. We worked with the churches. We worked with youth groups. So we worked with the community groups that we were familiar with. And definitely we used the radio to our advantage. We had a radio station in the Fijian vernacular, and we also used social media to the max. And we were able to get the word out. So here we are. So it was really wonderful that we were able to launch this project and actually name it in Fijian. So you can see here, Na Iau Wakaviti, Na Ka Marangeti, which is translated as Fijian treasures that are treasured. So that was how we utilized that title throughout the whole 12 months that we worked on this project. And yes, as I said, we had so many Fijian people from all over New Zealand. We were very fortunate that the Auckland Museum was a meeting place for one of the community leaders forum. And so we took advantage of that. So that's, I think, another action that some of you who are listening may be wondering, how can I reach out to our community? So once you know that these people do exist in a community, find out a representative and then organize events in the museum. And that's how we were able to get them in. So we were able to piggyback on these events. On the right-hand side, we were able to launch the Fijian Language Week at the museum. So we launched the Language Week, and then we got the chance to go down into the vault and see Fijian artifacts right there in your face. So that was really, really beautiful. On the right-hand side, this is a girl whose ancestry traces back to Fiji. Her name is Ebony. And we were able to also not just focus on artifacts, the photography department in the museum also knew what was happening. And they approached us and said, hey, we also have photographs from Fiji that are, you know, not named. We don't even know where they're taken, who is in the photo. And lo and behold, we got the Fijians to come in, and most of the photos were identified. Collaboration, yeah? And so we were able to get, this lady here is the wife of the community leader in Hamilton. So not only the people, Fijians in Auckland were part of this, also the Fijians in other parts of New Zealand. So we were really blessed. And this is the result. This is the result of our work. As you can see in the video, it was really nice to see some, you know, before and after shots of some of the artifacts that we worked together with. So one thing that was so important to us was the language. We really want to use the Itoke language, the Wasawakaviti, to be the primary language. And it was really amazing. So in the past, you know, it used to have water vessel, Fiji. Now we were able to come in as a team and rename it as Sangamoli Water Vessel. And not only just have just one title and there's empty information, we were able to add more. You know, who are the porters? Which tribes do they belong to? And how do these people get into these tribes in the first place? So it was all this intangible cultural heritage information that the museum didn't know we had. They were able to record them. So now, many of these artifacts, I think there's a couple more images there, Lisa. Thank you. So many of these images now are, you know, from a click of a button, from the comfort of your living room, any Fijian child around the world can access this information. So these are the different artifacts that have different names. So before they were just clumped as one, just water vessels, yeah, or pottery. Now we were able to name them individually. So this one here is Sanga Vonu, which is in the shape of a honu, yeah, or Vonu, a turtle. And all of these artifacts like Kitungele, they all have uses, yeah? They all have functions. And the museum were very, very blessed to have all this information recorded. Okay, so that's in a nutshell some of the key actions that we actually did at the Auckland Museum. And I hope that you will take a few points from some of the things we actually did. And this is one of the projects that I continue to talk about all the time here in Hawaii, and also throughout the world, in encouraging a lot of our other museums to do the same. Thank you so much. Mahalo nui for listening.
Okay, so thank you very much to all of our speakers. I've noted in the chat for anyone, if you have a question, we do have 10 minutes for some questions. So if you have any, we encourage you to please let us know in the group chat. And yeah, we'll go from there. Even if any of our other presenters might have a question too that they might like to ask, we encourage that as well.
I just want to, if I may, throw in that, I mean, this raises all kinds of wonderful and optimistic points. I don't want to wander off on them. I think they'll come up in discussion. But thank you three. That was very good. Sort of different pieces of the same picture. So mahalo.
Mahalo. We also, oh, any questions from anyone in from our other participants? No?
I think this is Tamiko. You want to ask something? Oh, yeah, Tamiko is raising her hand. You have to unmute yourself, Tamiko.
Oh. Well, we disabled the audio for participants, so we're encouraging everyone to input the questions into the chat.
Okay.
Oh, I can do that. I can do that.
Thank you very much, Tamiko. So the question is, how would the museum facilitate an event during a time of conflict? Anyone want to try to answer this question? Well, I'll try to take a stab at it because it's a question that we're all currently thinking about, and on a very large scale. I remember Tarisi awesomely just hosted this interesting webinar where we talked about the changing culture of philanthropy, but also the presenter brought up this conference that just recently happened, Death to Museums. It was this kind of, they called it an unconference, but really this idea that there needs to be certain changes that take place within institutions to address these kinds of needs. Something that I, as a practice of empathy, that I tell folks, or I have folks to consider, is that now everybody is experiencing a similar kind of conflict, at least in the US. Well, actually, the pandemic is global. These particular issues of conflict, of pandemics, of being in situations of duress, these are issues that communities of color and indigenous peoples deal with all the time. So this is an opportunity for folks to really consider the ways in which, if this is happening to me, how has this been happening to other people for longer periods of time within their own histories? And it's a way, I think, to bridge that divide that we have amongst settlers here in Hawaii in particular, as well as our indigenous communities here, because sometimes that connection isn't made, and it needs to be made explicit for folks to realize that, oh, actually, the things that I'm panicking about now are things people have been panicking about for a really long time and have got to the point of frustration because of not being heard. And so I think with regards to this question, that's one point that I see, is that it's an opportunity for all of us to come together to start to, really empathize with one another, but to understand that these are issues that affect all of us. And it's something that we've all been saying, especially communities of color and indigenous communities for such a long time, is that the things that, people like to say in this current political moment, that we vote on a one issue ticket, but actually when you look at Hawaiian issues, it's multifaceted. We're never just thinking about one thing, that we're thinking about multiple issues that need to be addressed at once. And so that's one angle that I just wanted to speak to with regards to this question. Helen, Tarisi?
Oh, Tarisi has her on. I'm gonna follow Tarisi.
Okay. All right, thank you. That's a very good question, and it brought to mind a few projects that we did in Aotearoa as well as Fiji. If I can share that example, you know, because we in Fiji, some of you may not be aware, we had a couple of political crises and you know some military coups that was race-based. So it was very important at that time for the museum to offer a neutral space, and that was very powerful for us. Because at the time of the first coup in 1987, it was a coup that was based on the race of the indigenous Itoke and the Indian population. And so at that time, the Fiji Museum didn't have an Indian gallery. And so it was very interesting that on top of this conflict, came an opportunity for the Indians to have their own Indo-Fijian gallery. So it was a very inclusive action that our director, Kate Vusoniwelala, did, which was very, very powerful. It was can be looked upon as controversial at that time, but she did it. And up until now, we have this gallery, and we were able to work with our Indian communities to actually get artifacts and record the stories. So it's that inclusivity that happened. And secondly, in New Zealand, if I can share that very quickly, I shared this in the last webinar at the Waikato Museum of Art and History in Hamilton. In the middle of the Tainui Iwi, we have the same director that I worked with in Fiji, Kate Vusoniwelala, who was a director at the Waikato Museum at the time. And she was able to bring in all these ethnic minorities that live in the Waikato region. And apparently at the time, there was a huge racial discrimination between the Maoris and the New Zealand Europeans with the Somali community. Because in Hamilton, there's a huge refugee community that was living in Hamilton. And then what happened? Kate Vusoniwelala invited the Somali community to come in and hosted their own exhibition and tell their story. That was just, you know, another example of how museums can offer a neutral space and offer these minority groups to have their voices heard. So I hope that's a wonderful example of these two institutions that were able to do it on the ground. So it's not just writing it, we actually did it.
Mm-hmm. And the only thing I would follow up on is that sometimes the conflict is not allowed to be addressed geographically. And so my experiences have been, especially, and it's not ethnically, but it was more, well, part of it was ethnically, but a lot of it were other cultural groups, LGBTQ and younger professionals versus older professionals. And so I would say you just make a forum, you provide a forum so that people can be heard. Mm-hmm. That's the main thing that anybody wants. They just want to know that they've been heard. And so if you give them that, and in today's world, it's so easy to do virtually. So if you provide them that venue, then at least you can show that you're trying toward reconciliation. You're not going to get 100% buy-in. No, you're not going to, you know, reconciliation is like a compromise, right? Not everybody's going to be 100% satisfied, but at least you've given people the venue to be heard.
I'd like to add to what Helen is saying, and there's actually concrete examples of this happening in Hawaii with regards to COVID and museum responses. One that I can think off the top of my mind, and if you folks know me on Instagram or Facebook, I'm one of those people that I try to follow every single nonprofit in Hawaii just to know what's happening in the nonprofit world, because people post really interesting projects. And one that I thought was a beautiful example of the kinds of programming or events you can facilitate at this time is at the Kona Historical Society is an example. They actually are creating programs and encouraging their community to share their stories about living through this pandemic with them. Because they are an institution that curates the history of Kona, this was an opportunity for them to capture this important and life-changing time that we're living in with regards to their own community. So that's a particular example of the ways in which a museum is responding to a current situation in a way that encourages the kinds of storytelling that Helen is alluding to, but also is trying to create this investment within the community that our institutions need if we are going to continue moving forward. So thank you, Tamiko, for your question. Any other questions from our participants? From our panelists? This is funny because the last time we had many questions.
Can I pose a question? Tarisi, because you've done the work with the Fijian Museum, I'm wondering, language was such an important piece, but there are multiple languages within Fiji. Can you talk about negotiating those choices as to which languages are representing what?
Yes, thank you so much for that question. In the case of New Zealand, it was quite easy because we were able to identify the major language that everyone used, which was called the Wasawakambau. So that was the Mbauan language that was put together by the missionaries when they came to Tonga and Fiji in the 1830s. So that was, kind of like a hands down easy decision, but the one in Fiji was harder, because we have 14 provinces with Rotuma coming in the mix, and each of these regions or provinces have their own dialects. So the same thing, the whole decision made by Kate Vusunuilala at the time is to use the primary language again of the Wasawakambau. However, we still insisted that the collections, the database has all the dialect names recorded. So on the label, because of space issues, we have just the Mbauan language as the primary language, and then followed by the English language. And of course, with living in New Zealand, they also have the Maori language component. But on the database, we were able to capture the words, like for example, some of the baskets, I have a name from Kandava where I'm from. And when you go to Nandronga, it's a different name. And then you go to different places, but all those information are captured online, so that at least the children who are from that area can still know, oh, my grandmother calls that basket this, or my grandfather calls this, adds this. So I hope I answered your question there, Poor Care. That was, it can be quite political too, but we had to try and make it as neutral as possible and be inclusive.
All right, we have time for one more question if anyone has anything that they really want to ask. Oh, Tarisi, you have a question? Or
someone else has a question, go for it. Yeah, I can see the question came through the chat. Yeah, go for it.
Oh, okay, we have a few questions that came up.
Yes.
So
Judy?
let's see. Let's go with Oriana because hers is looking first on mine. So going back to Helen's point on emic contextualization and direct experience, how do you encourage empathy and respectful communication between Indigenous cultural practitioners and non-Indigenous scholars? Ooh, that's a great
Love it, love it. I think the most important part would be educating the non-Indigenous scholars. I'm at an age where that's where I grew up with, was the non-Indigenous scholars, telling us about our culture. So that's the most important part, is that making people realize, and maybe it's a method of just introducing them to cultural competency and the precepts of it. To realize that, you may have studied this, but this does not mean you are the end all. I think if you are able to do that and have that self-awareness go off in their head, that's half the battle right there.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and non-Indigenous scholars. Yeah, you can't have empathy. You can't encourage empathy and respectful communication if they don't have that awareness. If they're going to continue to hang on to that awareness, to that belief that they know everything about that culture, then the other parts are not going to come through. It has to be an acceptance and a willingness to open themselves up. You can learn something, you can spend years, but you can definitely be a resource, but you cannot to discount people of that particular culture. It's going to be difficult.
I'd like to add as well that this question for me is one that I'm not quite sure if it's a question of empathy between the practitioners and the Indigenous scholars. I think it's more of a question of when the non-Indigenous scholar comes into a practitioner space, how then do they engage with the practitioners, and how do they do it in a way that is empathetic but also respectful of their time, of their resources, of their values. And I say this only because even if they are an Indigenous scholarship in itself is an extractive kind of enterprise in it. And as researchers, this is something that we have to and we should be keeping in mind, is that we are taking from these communities. So the question for the researcher is, what are we giving back to these communities? Are we just here to complete a project, to get the degree, or to get the grant, or are we really here and committed to the communities that we want to work with? And this is why I think, certain models like applied anthropology, Indigenous studies has a lot of it, community participatory projects. This is the kind of work where you get this longer term relationship that is required when you're doing this kind of work. It also makes me think of particularly folks who are working in Hawaiian language with kupuna and elders who speak Hawaiian as a first language. That's a long-term relationship that is maintained between the researcher who is doing their own work, but also making sure that these families receive the care that they need, that they're a part of their lives, that they're doing and providing resources without just taking. So that's how I kind of see this question. It's that it brings us back to this idea that if we're going to be doing this kind of research, then what are we doing to give back and to make the community know that we're here as resources for them? They're not our resources.
That's a huge paradigm shift, I think, for so many years. I used to do cultural impact assessments for EISs, and for so many years, people would just go interview the kupuna, and then, okay, now we can build our golf course or whatever, And I'm not going to speak for Pokea, but I think his experience with Mr. Kelsey and another family here in Moʻomeheu, that's a lifelong relationship. It's not a go in and you got the information that you wanted and on. That's what it is. It's lifelong relationships, and if you're not willing to do that, then you're not really interested in cultural competency. I believe. It's ongoing. It never ends. You don't become competent and say, okay, I know everything about that culture, time to move on, because the culture changes itself. So you have to be open to that.